Greetings. Tonight, we're venturing not to grand halls or legendary rulers, but to the overlooked corners of history, the parts that rarely appear in art or song. We're focusing on the common folk of olden times, those who didn't wield swords or don crowns. They endured sickness, famine, biting winds, and countless small struggles. None had titles or recognition. No fame, no lasting memory. Just endless labor, fleeting rest, and a quiet resilience most of us couldn't withstand for even a single day. If this calm, unhurried dive into the past helps soothe your mind, consider liking the video and subscribing, but only if it truly brings you peace. Drop a comment below sharing where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing others are out there, drifting off to these same gentle tales. So, lower the lights, switch on a fan if you enjoy its soft hum, get cozy, and let's begin at the edge of the forgotten world. This settlement has no name, or if it ever did, time erased it long ago. It rests in a modest hollow somewhere far from everything else. A subtle dip in the earth, distant enough to escape trade routes, records, or noble notice. You wouldn't spot it on a map, if such a map existed, which it doesn't. Maps are as foreign to you here as the stars themselves. Here, civilization fades away where the woods take over. The forest looms dense and deliberate, as though it belongs to an older age that merely tolerates your intrusion. The fields sprawl outward in uneven swaths of green and brown, until weary hands can barely lift themselves, only to rise again. Somewhere beyond lies a river, never seen by your eyes, only whispered about in tones reserved for myths or miracles. This is where life began for you, and this is where it will end. Perhaps 60 paces separate the two. The dwellings are crude and slouching, as though battered by too many winter's winds. Their walls are made of clem and fres, a mix of mud, straw, and twigs, painstakingly interwoven and endlessly patched with whatever scraps remain after the storms have had their fill. Thatched roofs droop under their own weight, forever leaking in spots too high to mend. The hamlet carries the scent of damp fabric, soot and soil, a sharp tang of animals mingled with hints of mildew. None of it startles you now. It's simply the aroma of existence here. The path leading in isn't much of a road, just a soggy trail carved by oxen carts whose wheels left ruts deep enough to gather puddles and pests alike. No person of note has walked this way in years. If ever, days drift by in silence, save for the faint toll of the bell from a distant chapel when the breeze deigns to carry its chime. Otherwise, time is marked by the sun's arc, the lengthening shadows stretching over the fields, or the familiar ache that creeps into your back before midday. Perhaps a dozen families reside here, enough to form a modest crowd on holy days. Everyone knows one another and everyone's troubles, but pretends not to notice until it becomes unavoidable. The closest thing to a leader is a man named Eldrick, who once conversed with a wandering scholar, and now recites fragments of that talk as evidence of his insight. No one challenges him. Eldrick's hut still stands. His cow appears healthy, and that suffices for authority around here. Precision doesn't exist in this place. There are no written records, no deeds, no surveys. Boundaries are defined loosely, past a gnarled oak or where the soil turns soggy. Disputes are resolved with shrugged shoulders, brief arguments, and occasionally a loaf of bread exchanged until neither side wishes to continue. There's no schoolhouse, no tavern, no inn. When a stranger arrives, it becomes a subject of gossip for weeks. Where did they come from? What do they seek? Are they cursed? Do they carry the scent of the sea? Newcomers inspire both fascination and unease. And no one leaves, not truly. Travel feels more like legend than possibility. You've heard tales of towns, cities, structures rising 2 or even 3 stories high. But these sound as mythical as beasts that speak or women who transform into birds. How can you yearn for a world you've never seen? The woods are impenetrable, the hills endless, and the paths, if they deserve a name, are notorious for bandits and misfortune rather than safe passage. What would you do elsewhere? Even if you reach such distant lands, you wouldn't understand their dialects, possess their currency, or grasp their customs. You don't even know your own age. So you remain. Familiarity offers safety, however harsh or monotonous. Even when the roof leaks, the well runs dry, and the same stew simmers for days. There's solace in routine. There's comfort in knowing where the firewood lies, whom to approach when your fence collapses, and which slice of sky signals the need to gather the sheep. You rise with dawn, rest at dusk, and labor in between. It isn't much, but it's life. And within its quiet cadence, there's peace. A peace that asks no questions, needing only what's visible from the nearest hilltop. Occasionally, word reaches you of wars, kings dying, or comets terrifying villages 5 days' journey away. But such news rarely arrives directly. Stories pass through too many lips to retain urgency. They lose meaning somewhere between the trader and the shepherd's cousin. Time itself feels different here. Seasons don't transition cleanly. They blur together. A damp spring morphs into a soggy summer. An early frost lingers into a boot-ruining winter. Years aren't counted. Harvests are dry ones, wet ones. The disastrous year when the wheat rotted black. The bountiful season when oats overflowed, and even gruff old Hilda smiled for days. His bailiff visits, collects grain, asks questions, scribbles notes. You respond cautiously, avoiding specifics. He seems to dislike detail. You've never met the king. You're uncertain what he does, though you murmur his name in prayers, just in case. Here on the edge of everything, little changes, and when it does, it's usually for the worse. Still, the hearth glows, the roof mostly holds, and the cottage stays warm. Tomorrow, the same sun will crest the same hills. For now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but most will trace circles. Most medieval villagers never ventured far from home. Not due to lack of curiosity, energy, or sturdy shoes. Those shoes were often scarce. But because the world beyond felt foreign, the notion of seeking it as fanciful as flight. You grew up memorizing every plot of land between your home and the field's edge. You knew the silhouette of every stump along the path to the well. You could identify travelers by the depth of their footprints in the mud. Beyond that, the world grew abstract. The neighboring village might lie only 5 miles distant, yet it might as well be another realm. Tales reached you, marriages, thefts, complaints about the priest snoring, but you'd never seen it yourself, nor likely would, for travel was perilous. Not in an exciting sense. It was perilous in the wearying, potentially deadly way. Roads weren't tidy paths lined with signs and fellow travelers. They were muddy trails weaving through forests, fields, and vast stretches of silent emptiness. No maps guided you, only vague directions. Follow the crooked birch, then turn right past a rock shaped like a sleeping dog. Along those paths lurked dangers. First, the forest. Medieval woods weren't picturesque parks. They were dense, shadowy, tangled with roots and alive with unidentifiable sounds. Bears, wolves, people hiding from the law. If you weren't born to the woods, they didn't welcome you. Second, bandits. Men and women with nothing to lose and no fields to tend. Travelers were targets, especially if they appeared remotely prosperous. A man walking briskly might be presumed wealthy. A woman traveling alone might signal possession of something worth stealing. Confidence offered no protection. Third, getting lost. This wasn't a minor concern. Wander off course, and no rescuers awaited. Following a river downstream led nowhere certain. Days could pass without encountering another soul. Your body might vanish into the undergrowth like mist. Folks wouldn't realize you were missing until the next feast day, when someone finally inquired, and another simply shrugged. Then there were the practical worries. If you ventured too far, who would tend your crops? Who would feed the livestock? What if the steward arrived to collect his dues while you were gone? You couldn't explain absence to a man clutching a ledger. Your responsibilities didn't pause just because you yearned to see what lay beyond the horizon. And even if you reached another village, then what? You weren't anticipated. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders brought trouble. Disease, crime, strange notions. Your dialect differed slightly. Your phrases sounded odd. Perhaps even how you held your spoon seemed foreign. Suspicion might greet you, or worse. Hospitality wasn't guaranteed. Food was scarce. Beds were already occupied. The safest place was home, not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. You knew which part of the roof leaked, which chickens roam too far, which neighbor might lend a tool without prying. Out there, no one owed you anything. Still, some people traveled occasionally, not peasants usually, but merchants, monks, messengers, those with protection or purpose or both. Once or twice a year, they'd pass through with carts laden with wool or salted fish, trailing stories like campfire smoke. They spoke of cities where buildings rose from stone, shops sold spices, and streets didn't dissolve into mud with every rain. It sounded impossible. You listened, but you didn't dare dream too much. Because even if their tales were true, what would you do in such a place? You couldn't read. You had no coin. You wouldn't know the customs. The city could swallow you whole, and no one would remember your name. So you stayed, not out of fear, though sometimes you were afraid, but because you had duties: a fence to mend, a niece to care for, barley to dry, and a dozen other tasks before the sun sank below. The trillion. And because, honestly, you didn't need the world to be larger than it was. The village sufficed. It had gossip, conflict, weather, illness, fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells and the turning of seasons, the quiet pride of enduring another day. Sometimes you dreamed of exploring beyond the woods, but most days you simply hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. The village sufficed. It had gossip, conflict, weather, sickness, and fleeting joys. It had the rhythm of bells, the turning of seasons, and the quiet pride of surviving another day. Sometimes you dreamed of seeing what lay beyond the woods, but most days you just hoped the stew wouldn't burn while you fetched water. Some people did leave, usually the desperate, the reckless, or the ambitious. A young man might set off seeking work, adventure, or a cause worth dying for. He might return with a limp, a story, or not at all. When he didn't come back, no one said much, just shook their heads and muttered. He went past the trees, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. For those who stayed, life was small, but it was also known. You weren't lonely exactly. You shared your days with family, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in repetition, comfort in familiar complaints. You didn't need to visit distant cities to understand the value of warmth, taste cinnamon to savor sweetbread, or cross kingdoms to feel love, sorrow, boredom, or hope. As the years passed and aches settled deeper into your joints, as children grew tall in the fence posts, the idea of travel faded. Not with regret, but with understanding. Some were meant to move. You were meant to stay. There's no blueprint, no architect, no pile of neatly labeled materials waiting to be assembled. Just mud, wood, and whatever else the land hadn't already claimed. Your home isn't a house, not in the way most imagine one. It's more a compromise between shelter and weather, effort and decay, what you needed and what the land begrudgingly offered. You begin with the frame. Rough-hewn timbers from nearby trees, cut with tools handed down through countless hands. The wood isn't straight. It bends, it warps. But you don't mind. Neither are your walls. Once the frame stands, you weave thin branches or flexible sticks between the posts, a process called Lee. It's not elegant. It's not quick. But it holds together, much like the rest of your life. Then comes a daub, a mix of mud, straw, dung, and water. You slap it on by hand, press it into gaps, smooth it just enough to keep the wind out, pretending it's deliberate. It dries slowly, cracking in the sun, occasionally crumbling in clumps that must be patched before winter. You grow accustomed to the smell. Eventually, you stop noticing. The roof is thatch, layers of dried straw packed tightly and tied to beams. When fresh, it's golden, almost lovely. Then the rains come. Then the birds come. Then time comes. The color fades. Edges fray. Holes appear where you least expect them. You start placing buckets where you hope never to need them. You don't shingle it. You don't waterproof it. You just keep patching until the roof threatens to become more patched than roof. At some point, you wonder if living under a cart might be easier. The floor is dirt. You tell yourself it's packed firm, and it sort of is. Years of walking, sweeping, spilling, and stomping have turned it into something almost solid. But when it rains, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When goats wander in at night, who knows what's underfoot? You might spread rushes or straw to cover it. It helps a little. But soon the straw grows damp, dirty, trampled to dust. Then you sweep it out and start over, or don't. Eventually, the straw becomes a floor, and you accept it as part of the landscape. Windows, technically openings in the wall, are covered with wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close flush. Glass is too expensive, too rare, too fragile. So the wind blows in, the cold seeps in, the sound of animals outside drift in, and sometimes the animals themselves. There's a single door, usually hung crooked because the frame shifted during the last frost. It latches with a hook or wooden peg, not for security. There's nothing to steal. It's to keep chickens from wandering out and wind from blowing in. Inside, the layout is best described as shared. One room, maybe two if someone managed to tack on a lean-to or loft, but usually just one where you sleep, eat, cook, men talk, argue, and hope. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, a cousin or two, a grandparent, maybe a neighbor's child whose parents are sick or gone, or both. There's a hearth in the center, built of stone if you're lucky, clay if you're not. Smoke rises through a hole in the roof, more or less. No chimney. The air inside is always smoky, warm, damp, carrying a faint scent of stew reheated one too many times. Furniture is sparse. A table, a bench, maybe a stool, a chest if someone in your family was unusually skilled at carving or very fortunate in marriage. Beds are wooden frames stuffed with straw or feathers, often shared, usually squeaking. Blankets are woolen, heavy, rough, never quite dry. Storage fills the rafters. Garlic, onions, herbs, maybe a small ham if the pig was kind that year. You can smell the difference between early winter and late spring just by the air above your head. Sometimes it's comforting. Sometimes it's a reminder of how close you are to running out. Animals are part of the household, literally. The cow might sleep in the same room, tucked in a corner. Chickens, too. A goat. It's not ideal. It's not sanitary, but it's warm. You learn to tune out the clucks, shuffles, and occasional startled bleat in the middle of the night. They blend into background noise, like wind in the thatch or the slow, settling creak of the walls. Nothing is level. The floor dips, the roof slants. The walls bulge slightly, as though the whole structure breathes with the seasons. You fix what you can. You ignore what you can't. Every spring, you swear you'll repair the back wall. Every autumn, it's still leaning. It's not a house built to last. It's a house built to endure the next storm. And yet, for all its flaws, and there are many, it's home. You know where the cold creeps in and how to block it with an old sack. You know which roof beam can hold a pot and which one creaks when someone stands too close. You know how the light filters through the slats in the afternoon and where the dog curls up to sleep. When strangers pass through, they see poverty. You see effort, reuse, resourcefulness. A roof that hasn't collapsed is a victory. A fire that still burns at dawn is a blessing. A dry corner is worth more than gold. And when you lie down at the end of the day, surrounded by snores, silence, smoke, and straw, you feel a strange kind of comfort. Not pride exactly, but presence. This is your space. It bends. It leaks. It shifts with the wind. But it holds. And so have you. For the average medieval villager, food was not an experience. It wasn't colorful, diverse, or even particularly warm. It was more like a daily puzzle that had to be solved over and over, using the same meager ingredients and weary hope that something edible might emerge. Your kitchen, if such a term applied, was simply a corner of your one-room home near the hearth. There was no pantry, no shelves stocked with ingredients, no carefully hung herbs and sunny windows. Just a pot, a fire, and a short list of items you prayed hadn't spoiled. At the heart of nearly every meal was pottage, a kind of perpetual stew that lived in the pot and never fully stopped simmering. It was never entirely fresh, never completely gone. You added to it during the day, skimmed it at night, kept it warm through the seasons, and prayed nothing strange grew while your back was turned. The ingredients depended on what you had. Usually not much. On a good day, pottage might include cabbage, leeks, barley, and a few legumes. Perhaps garlic or onions if the harvest had been kind. In winter, dried beans or peas took center stage. If fortune smiled, A scrap of salted pork might find its way in. More often, it was just the bone. Even that was precious. A single bone could boil for days, its essence coaxed out in hopes it would recall the taste of meat. The flavor was consistent. Earthy, gray, more about warmth than taste. You didn't eat pottage for enjoyment. You ate it because it was all you had. A hot meal at the end of the day was more than comfort. It was a small triumph. The pot itself rarely got clean. It was wiped down, occasionally scraped, but seldom scrubbed. Each new batch absorbed traces of the last. There were no spices to mask the monotony, no vinegar to brighten it. Just a slow, dependable dullness. A taste like boiled history. Bread played the other leading role. Not soft, golden, or inviting, but hard, dense, and dark. It was typically made from rye, barley, or oats. Wheat, the soft, white variety, was reserved for the upper classes. Peasants could scarcely afford to glimpse it, let alone bake with it. Loaves were small and heavy, barely rising before baking. They crumbled easily. Leave them out for a day, and they could double as weapons, but they filled stomachs and provided something to soak in your stew. Sometimes bread was made from questionable additions. Chaff, ground peas, or whatever remained at the bottom of the miller's barrel. In dire times, people used bark, not metaphorically. They literally ground the inner layer of tree bark and mixed it with their scant flour. The result was famine bread, bitter, dense, and barely digestible. Technically, it kept you alive. On days when even flour ran scarce, people resorted to trenchers, stale slices of bread used as plates. These soaked up stew and were either eaten at the end of the meal or tossed to animals. Occasionally, they were passed down the table to someone of lower status. Bread hierarchy at its finest. Protein was rare, very rare. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. Livestock wasn't eaten unless absolutely necessary. Every part was used: meat, fat, organs, bones. Blood became puddings. Fat was rendered. Heads turned into soup. Nothing went to waste. Pork was the most common meat when available. Pigs were efficient, and their salted fat flavored many dishes, transforming the barely edible into something vaguely palatable. But pigs were slaughtered only out of necessity. A whole pig meant weeks of planning, salting, hanging, boiling, and storing. Fishing was possible if you lived near water, though it came with restrictions. Many rivers and lakes belonged to lords, and fishing without permission could earn you a fine, or worse. When fishing did occur, it was usually for eels, small river fish, or anything that wouldn't spoil immediately. Salted herring, if obtainable, was prized. The church dictated much of your diet. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden, so you turned to fish or went without. In more creative interpretations, beaver tails were classified as fish, a theological workaround few questioned, because it meant having something to eat. Milk was common but fragile. It had to be used quickly or turned into cheese or butter. Butter was a luxury in some households, used sparingly. Cheese was harder, tangier, and often quite dry. Storing a few good rounds meant the cow had been generous that year. Dairy, though useful, didn't always agree with everyone, and refrigeration was non-existent. Sour milk was still consumed, butter turned rancid, cheese molded. You simply cut away the worst parts and hoped your stomach could handle the rest. Drinks were simple. Water was unreliable, often unsafe depending on the season and what careless upstream neighbor had done. So ale became the default. Weak ale, known as small beer, was brewed at home and drunk by everyone, including children. It contained low alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria and blunt the edge of thirst. If apples or pears were available, you might make cider. Wine belonged to clergy and nobility. Mead was rare. Milk was reserved for the young and sick. Otherwise, it was ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to help forget that tomorrow's meals would taste exactly like today's. Vegetables formed the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks. Carrots existed, though not the orange ones we know now. Medieval carrots were white or purple. Most vegetables were grown in small gardens, tended carefully, and eaten root to leaf. Nothing went to waste. Turnip tops might be boiled into greens. Skins were composted or thrown into the fire. Fruit was seasonal, mostly apples. Berries or wild plums appeared occasionally. If dried, they lasted through winter. Otherwise, they were eaten quickly. Preservation was difficult. Sugar was nearly impossible to afford. Honey, if you kept bees, was a treasured sweetener. Otherwise, your pottage remained savory in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs were cultivated when possible. Parsley, sage, dill, mint. They weren't used for flavor so much as for medicine or tradition. Some herbs were believed to ward off illness. Others kept pests at bay. Occasionally, they even improved the taste. But that was a happy accident, not the goal. Meals were shared together on benches around the fire. There were no courses, no recipes, just a pot, a chunk of bread, and the hope that something would remain for tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't make the stew thicker. If there was a feast, a wedding, harvest festival, or Saint's Day, you might roast a bird or bake a pie. Not the flaky, buttery kind. A medieval pie was more like a sealed box made of hard dough to hold a meat filling. Often heavily spiced if spices were available, which they rarely were. You might use pepper, ginger, or cinnamon. If someone had traded well, most days weren't feast days. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl clean. You soaked your bread. You drank your ale and leaned back, full enough to get through the evening. If not exactly satisfied, there was comfort in repetition. Knowing what the pot would taste like, how much bread was left, watching the same hands prepare the same meal by the same fire. As the wind whispered through cracks in the wall and animals shifted in their sleep, the stew bubbled, the bread cooled, and once again, you had enough. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't own much. You might have a patch of land, a few tools, a couple of animals, a crooked house built with your own hands, but none of it was truly yours. It all belonged to the Lord, not a king, not some mythical figure far away, but the local landholder, the one who lived up the hill in a slightly less crooked house, with slightly better food and a roof that probably didn't leak. He owned the land, which meant he owned everything on it, including, in a sense, you. You were what was called a villain. That wasn't an insult. It was a category. You worked the land but didn't own it. You were bound to it. You couldn't leave without permission. You couldn't pass it on freely. You owed labor, goods, and deference. You weren't a slave, but you weren't exactly free either. Your relationship with the Lord wasn't based on conversation. It was based on obligation. You didn't talk to him directly. Instead, you dealt with the steward, the man who manages lands, and more importantly, kept track of what everyone owed. And you owed a lot. Let's start with labor. A few days a week, sometimes more during harvest, you were expected to work the Lord's fields instead of your own. This was called corvée labor. You received nothing for it. No payment, no thanks. Just the knowledge that somewhere in a manor house, someone ate because of your efforts. You also owed taxes, which came in many forms. A portion of your grain, a share of your wool, a chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. If you had a pig, you owed bacon. If you caught fish, guess who owned the river? The taxes didn't end with food. If you used a mill, you paid a fee. Even though the mill was the only way to grind your grain, and even though the Lord owned the mill and set the price, you might be tempted to grind it by hand. But doing so was often illegal, punishable by fines, or worse, because the Lord didn't just want to share, he wanted control. The same went for the oven. Many manors had a communal oven, which you paid to use. If you tried baking at home and the steward found out, there could be consequences. You learned to do things the official way, even if it took longer, cost more, and made less sense. And then there were the fees. Want to get married? Pay a fee. Want to inherit your father's plot? There's a fee. Want to move to another village? First, ask permission. Then, as you guessed, pay a fee. Your livestock was taxed, your tools sometimes taxed. Even your ability to breed livestock without permission was barely untaxed. And what did you get in return? Well, theoretically, the Lord was supposed to protect you if bandits attacked or a rival noble invaded. The Lord had armed men who could fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores, though rarely for free. And if you had a legal dispute, say, your neighbor's goat wandered into your garden and refused to leave, The Lord's court might settle it. Again, not for free. This was feudalism, a system of obligations and hierarchy wrapped in a language of loyalty and protection. In practice, it was a system of ownership. The land was everything. Those who owned it ruled. Those who worked it obeyed. The manor itself stood apart from the village, sometimes literally on higher ground. It might be made of stone or timber, larger than any peasant's home, with a roof thatched so thick no wind dared enter. Inside were tapestries, tables, servants, and of course, the Lord, wearing wool lined with fur, eating meals you couldn't imagine, and thinking very little about you. He might not know your name, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you owed this year, how many eggs you promised, whether your son had reached the age where he could be added to the labor rolls. Everything was recorded, not by you, since you couldn't read, but by the steward, the reeve, the bailiff, men with wax tablets or bits of parchment who came around with questions you learned to answer carefully. And if you didn't meet your obligations, there were punishments, fines, usually more goods taken, extra days of labor. In extreme cases, your tools could be confiscated, your land reclaimed, or your house, goats, dignity, all of it gone. You didn't resist. Resistance was a rebellion. It was foolishness. But here's the strange part. The system worked, not because it was fair, but because it was stable. It had rules, predictable if harsh. You knew what you owed. You knew what was expected. There was no guessing, no sudden surprises, just a steady, grinding rhythm of give, give. And occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord would give something back. A feast day where food was distributed. A holiday where labor was waived. A kind word, perhaps spoken from horseback. Not enough to balance the scales, but enough to keep things from tipping. The relationship was never friendly, but it was enduring. Your Lord might be young or old, kind or cruel, present or distant, but he was always above. You didn't question that. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right words. Not because he deserved it, but because you didn't want trouble. And maybe deep down, a small part of you still hoped that one day you might be noticed, rewarded, lifted, even just a little. It almost never happened. But that's how the system endured, not solely through fear, but with the faintest glimmer of hope. The hope that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, prayed fervently enough, something might change. Meanwhile, the steward kept walking, the reeve kept recording, the mill kept grinding, and you kept plunging your hands into the soil year after year, season after season. There was no retirement, no bonus, no upward mobility, only the quiet acknowledgement that you had fulfilled your role. You had done what was expected. You had survived another year under the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was satisfied, you were permitted to keep living. Long before Black Death swept across Europe and etched itself into history books, medieval peasants were already intimately familiar with sickness. Not the kind of illness that came and went with the seasons, though there was plenty of that too, but the slow, constant presence of something always waiting to go wrong. Infection, fever, wasting, swelling, coughing. Disease was an event. It was a feature of life. You didn't need a continent-wide catastrophe to be brought low. All it took was a small cut, a single flea, a sip of water that looked clear but wasn't. And unlike weather or taxes, illness didn't follow rules. It arrived without warning and rarely left quietly. There were no hospitals. Not really. If you were fortunate, your village had a wise woman, perhaps a midwife, someone who knew which herbs to boil and which to burn. If you were extremely lucky, there might be a monk nearby, literate, well-meaning, and slightly more effective than random prayer. But for the most part, when you fell ill, you stayed home. You lay in bed, sweated through your shirt, and hoped. Most people didn't understand what caused disease. The word germ hadn't been invented yet. Microscopes were centuries away. What you had were theories, old ones, confusing ones, and often wrong ones. Some believed in miasma, bad air that carried disease through smell. If a village reeked of rot, manure, and smoke, it was assumed to be dangerous, which in a way was correct, though not for the reasons people thought. To combat the bad air, people stuffed herbs into their clothes, carried flowers in their sleeves, or walked around with vinegar-soaked rags pressed to their faces. Not pleasant, not helpful, but deeply believed. Others blamed divine punishment. Illness came from sin, impure thoughts, disobedient acts, or general moral decay. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your crops failed and then your body failed, it was probably your fault or your neighbor's or both. There were local traditions, too. Some thought illness came from the evil eye, a glare from someone jealous or angry. Others blamed moon phases, animal spirits, or grumpy saints. One particularly popular explanation was that sickness entered the body through the soles of the feet. The solution? Boil them. And if that didn't work, burn something nearby, possibly your mattress. The cures were as strange as the causes. If you had a fever, you might be bled. A local man would arrive with a blade, a bowl, and more confidence in training. Sometimes leeches were used. Sometimes sharp stones. The idea was to balance your humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If they were out of sync, so were you? No one ever saw these humors, of course, but they were blamed for nearly everything. For swelling. There were poultices, smears of mashed herbs, mud, or even bread wrapped in cloth and tied to the body. Some worked, most didn't. A few made things worse. But the important thing was that something was being done. If your stomach ached, you might chew on charcoal. If you coughed blood, you might drink wine mixed with crushed pearls. If your eyes blurred, someone might whisper a prayer while blowing smoke over your head. If your leg turned black, you were probably out of options. And then there were the plague amulets, bits of metal or bone worn around the neck, sometimes inscribed protective words, sometimes blessed by a priest. Some people buried onions in the corners of their homes. Others hung garlic above the door. One popular remedy was to tie a live chicken to the infected area and hope the illness transferred to the bird. It rarely did, but hope was scarce, and people clung to whatever they could. Sickness was isolating, but not in the way we think of now. You didn't quarantine. You didn't call for help. You just tried to work until you couldn't. When that moment came, you lay down and others carried on. Children were fed, animals were tended, and you were given broth, maybe along with a few murmured prayers. Sometimes illness passed, the fever broke, the swelling went down. You walked again slowly, with a new limp and a deeper respect for warm soup. Other times it didn't, and your family lit a candle. Plague, in the broader sense, wasn't always a dramatic kind that left bodies in carts. More often, it was a slow infection. Skin turning dark, limbs swelling, a cough deep enough to rattle the walls. Smallpox, leprosy, dysentery. Even the flu could sweep through a village and leave half the population in bed. There were no case numbers, no charts, just stories. A traveler from another village said the cough had started there last week. Or someone heard that 3 children had died near the river. You paid attention. You started boiling more water. You left herbs under the door. You kept your distance, even if no one said why. Death was not always feared, but it was recognized. People knew when it was near. They knew the signs. Breathing that slowed, skin that cooled, eyes that turned dull. There were prayers for the dying, soft ones whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally arrived in the 14th century, it struck with a violence that overshadowed everything before it. But by then, the world was already familiar with sickness. The idea that you could be well in the morning and gone by night was not new. It was just happening more often. The plague came in waves, each time returning stronger, stranger. Buboes swelling in the neck and groin, fevers that stole the mind, blood that darkened and bubbled. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages vanished. Fields lay fallow until bells rang too often. Some peasants tried to flee, but disease traveled faster than feet. Others turned to religion, doubling their prayers, whipping their backs, promising to live better if they were spared. A few turned to violence, blaming outsiders, sinners, anyone but the wind. The church offered explanations, comfort, and burial. Monks died in droves. Priests vanished. In some places, death became so common that funerals were skipped. Bodies were buried in mass graves, often without names. And yet, life continued. People learned how to survive alongside sickness. They accepted it the way they accepted hunger or cold, not joyfully, but with a kind of weary resilience. They cleaned their homes more often. They shared herbs. They whispered new prayers. Some believed surviving one sickness granted protection against the next. Others didn't believe at all. But they got up anyway and milked the cow. Children grew up learning which plants to avoid, which to chew, and which to boil until they stopped smelling like feet. They knew how to wrap a wound, how to wait out a fever, how to tell when someone wasn't going to get better, and when to stop hoping. And through it all, they didn't stop living. They married, they harvested, they shared meals, such as they were. They sat by the fire and retold stories of the last illness, and the time someone's grandfather survived a winter fever with nothing but garlic water and stubbornness. Plague wasn't the end of the world. It was just another part of it. And for those who endured, survival became its own kind of resistance. A quiet, stubborn refusal to go quietly. A belief that tomorrow would come. And if it didn't, someone else would. Remember your name, or at least the way you always added rosemary to the broth. Night in the medieval countryside wasn't peaceful. It was silent in the way a cave is silent, full of creaks, distant sounds, and the kind of quiet that makes you notice how loudly your own body exists. The day ended when the light failed, and everything that wasn't already put away had to be dealt with quickly, because once darkness fell, the world shrank to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light. No candles burning freely into the night. Wax was too valuable. If you had a tallow lamp, it was reserved for emergencies or religious devotions. Most nights, the fire dimmed, the coals glowed softly, and that was all. And so you slept, but not in the way we think of sleep today. Not in a single unbroken stretch. Sleep in the Middle Ages came in 2 acts. First sleep, then a waking period, and finally a second sleep. This rhythm wasn't accidental. It was how people adapted to the long, lightless hours between dusk and dawn. You would drift into your first sleep not long after nightfall. The fire would be banked, the animals quieted, and children hushed. The home, 1 room, maybe 2, stretched out into stillness. If you had a mattress, it was stuffed with straw or feathers, possibly lumpy, often shared. If you didn't, you slept on woven rushes or directly on the earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together. Family, relatives, even servants, all in one shared space, not out of closeness but necessity. It was the only warm room in the house. On the coldest nights, even animals were brought inside. A goat near the door, a dog curled by the hearth, chickens in a basket. Warmth was more important than boundaries. There was no privacy. Sleeping alone was associated with punishment, not comfort. The rich might afford solitude. Everyone else may do. You turned to face the wall, stuff straw in your ears, share blankets, and breathe in each other's breath. And if someone snored, and someone always did, you got used to it. First sleep lasted a few hours. Then, almost like clockwork, people would wake. It wasn't disturbing, it was expected. During this time, often around midnight, the world was still and quiet. Some prayed. Others stirred the coals. Some used a chamber pot or stepped outside into the freezing air. Some reflected. Others whispered. It was also a time of vivid dreams. People believed this midnight space opened a thin veil between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the mundane. If you dreamed during this waking interval, you remembered it and talked about it the next morning, not casually, but as something that mattered. Eventually, the second sleep began, deeper, slower. This was the sleep that healed, or tried to. It was when the day's aches faded slightly, when blisters cooled. If you were lucky, it was uninterrupted. If not, you simply lay still and waited for dawn to give you an excuse to rise. The home didn't go silent at night. Not entirely. The fire crackled. Wind whispered through the thatch. A baby might fuss. A cow might shuffle its hooves. Sometimes the night was broken by coughing, the wet, rattling kind that never seemed to end. Everyone noticed, but no one said anything. It was understood. The fear of the dark was real and not irrational. The night carried real dangers, both imagined and physical. Wolves, for instance. In some regions, their howls came close enough to the village to raise hairs on the back of your neck. They weren't just creatures of legend. They were real and hungry. Then there were thieves, rogues, fires sparked by careless coals, roofs groaning under snow, and less explainable things. Ghosts, spirits, demons, witches. You didn't talk about them openly, but you knew they were out there. To protect the household, you followed rituals. You placed iron by the door, made the sign of the cross above the hearth, whispered protective blessings over the straw mattress, hung herbs, rosemary, sage, rue, above entryways. Sometimes you tied a bit of string around a child's wrist, just in case. Even with protection, some families believe sleep left you vulnerable, that the soul wandered while the body rested. So people tucked in carefully, covered mirrors, faced the bed toward the fire, avoided sleeping with feet pointed toward the door. The cold was its own enemy. It seeped through walls, through thatch, through poorly sealed doors. People didn't sleep under mounds of blankets. They layered wool, fur, cloaks, tunics. The idea of undressing for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in your clothes, sometimes in your boots. There was comfort in sleeping next to others, but also discomfort. Someone always shifted, murmured, elbowed you, or kicked you. The family dog might surprise you, but this was normal. You didn't expect silence, you expected closeness. And in that closeness, you found a strange kind of security. You heard your father breathe, your child twitch, your grandmother mutter a prayer in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was human. It was shared. When you dreamed, your dreams mattered. A field of wheat might mean prosperity. A snake, illness. A broken tooth, death. You learned to interpret these things, or found someone who could. The village had dream readers, unofficially, but everyone knew who to ask. The church had its own ideas. It warned that some dreams came from the devil, that sleep was a time when temptation could slip in. You were told to pray before bed to avoid certain thoughts, to keep your soul ready in case the night was your last, because it could be. People went to sleep and didn't wake up. Illness could take hold while you rested. A fever could rise, a cough deepen. By morning, summer might be gone quietly as if stolen. This uncertainty gave every morning a slightly reverent tone. When the light returned, the rooster cried out and the coals were stirred back to life. It meant you'd survived again. You sat up slowly. Every joint reminded you of your age, no matter how young you were. The cold bit your nose. You wiped your face, looked around, counted bodies. Everyone who stirred was accounted for. Those who didn't were checked on. Once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water fetched, bread prepared, animals fed. The dream you had, if it was important, was shared. The memory of the night faded, not erased, just softened, folded into the next stretch of time. In winter, sleep came early and stayed late. In summer, it shortened, but the rhythm remained. First sleep, a waking hour, second sleep. A world without clocks, but not without routine. And for all its discomfort, there was something grounding in that rhythm, something honest. You didn't aim for comfort. You aimed for endurance. And if you happen to find rest along the way, a moment of warmth, a particularly quiet night, a dream that didn't leave you afraid, that was a gift, one you didn't question, one you didn't expect to gain too soon. Some years you were simply hungry. Other years, you were in a famine. It wasn't the same. Hunger was manageable. It had rules. You stretched food, rationed, hoped, but famine broke the rules. It was when the fields failed, the root cellar was bare, and there was no more pretending that next week would be better. It was when food became an idea more than a substance. In a medieval village, you often saw it coming. It started in the spring. Too much rain or none. The barley came up patchy. The beans flowered then browned. The cabbages cracked open too early. The wheat head stayed stunted, bowed as if mourning something. You noticed. Everyone did. At first, no one said it, but the looks were exchanged. Quiet calculations were made internally. How much was left from last year? How much seed could we keep? How much could we afford to eat? The answers were never good. The hardest part was knowing what to do next, not in winter, but in summer, because that's when you had to choose between planting the seeds or grinding them into flour, between saving for a harvest that might never come or feeding your child one more bowl of something warm. And so the portions began to shrink. The stew got thinner, the bread smaller. The bowls didn't come back empty. They just came back less often. You didn't panic. Not yet. You told yourself this had happened once before, or that another village might have extra, or that the manor stores could fill the gaps. Hope was still on the table, just not much else. By August, it became harder to ignore. By September, it became impossible. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens grew quiet. Goats bleating turned hollow. The dog, if you had one, stopped barking and started following you more closely, as if it understood it was next. Bread became ritual. One loaf split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slower. No one commented on the crust. Even the smallest crumb was swept up with reverence. The stew was now mostly water. If it had color, it was from the pot. You boiled weeds, ground roots, pulled up things you didn't recognize, hoping they weren't poisonous. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night. Not because you were afraid, but because your stomach reminded you every few hours that it was still empty. The children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't ask when the bread was coming. They didn't beg for honey. They didn't plead for stories. They sat close to the fire and stared, learning how to wait. Your neighbors disappeared from the lanes. The village grew quiet. No laughter, no arguments about sheep, just the occasional cough or crackle of firewood. Famine didn't make people cruel. It made them silent. Sometimes someone brought back a rabbit, a bird, or a handful of acorns that could be soaked and ground. You chewed them even when bitter, smiling not because they tasted good, but because they were something. You tried not to resent the manner. Sometimes they gave grain. Sometimes they didn't. The steward came around less. Good because he wasn't there to take. Bad because he wasn't there to help. His silence spoke volumes. The church did what it could. Bread after mass. Alms of poorest. But they too were stretched thin. You prayed more, not out of faith but repetition. Words came easily when your hands were too tired to do anything else. Some left the village entirely, packing up to find work, food, or God. Some returned. Some didn't. You never asked what happened. You were too tired. Famine changed your body. You felt your ribs first, not from the outside but from within, as if they pressed against your skin. You stood slower, bruised easier, woke with clenched hands as though still gripping tools you couldn't afford to use anymore. The cold hurt more. The fire became your best friend. You spent more time tending it than cooking on it. You sat close, slept facing it, fed it even as your belly emptied. Heat was the one luxury you could still provide. By now, you'd eaten everything edible, the roots, the weeds, the dried beans, the stale flour. You boiled bones 3 times over, soaked bark, baked famine bread that cracked your teeth. When food ran out, you turned to things that weren't food but might become so in the right light. Liver, boiled and salted. Not delicious, not satisfying, but technically chewable. Once you found a rat. You didn't scream. You thanked God, hid it, cooked it alone, told no one. You still felt guilty but didn't regret it. Dreams grew strange. You dreamed of feasts, tables laden with roast bread and wine, and woke chewing your tongue. You dreamed of boiling things endlessly, though you hadn't boiled anything in days. You dreamed of animals returning, green shoots breaking through snow, childhood when hunger was simpler. Some nights, you dreamed of being full and woke crying. The graveyard filled slowly at first, then quickly, until it overwhelmed. You knew someone had died when the church bell didn't ring. It meant there weren't enough hands to lift the rope. Graves were shallow, prayers short, mourning silent. Everyone managed their own hunger. You wanted to grieve, but couldn't spare the emotion. Then, like every famine, it ended, not suddenly but steadily. Rain came and stayed. The ground softened. Seeds germinated. Plants reached skyward, weak but real. You regained enough energy to hope again. You saved the first harvest for others. Children first, elders next. You took the smallest bowl, smiled as you passed it, and when the first good loaf emerged from the oven, cracked on top, dark on the bottom, you stared at it before eating. You remembered every day you went without, every trick you used, every lie you told to spare someone else. You ate slowly, and this time it filled you. By the time you could walk, The church had already marked you. It had taken your name at baptism, blessed your breath with Latin you'd never understand, and stitched your soul into a system that extended far beyond your village. You belonged to the church not by choice, but because there was no alternative. In quiet moments, dim mornings before the fire caught, wet nights when wind howled through shutters, you felt its presence like gravity. It didn't merely exist alongside your life. It organized, judged, taxed, forgave, and defined what came after. The church wasn't a place you visited. It was the air around you, the road beneath your feet, the rhythm of your year. It murmured over your grave and whispered about it decades before you arrived. The village priest, often the only literate person, was more than your confessor. He was your calendar, counselor, and nearest thing to an oracle. He held mysteries of the sky, stories of saints, explanations for why pigs died or storms came. He walked through the village like a man carrying both blessing and thread in his robes. You whispered your sins to him, hoping he wouldn't look disappointed. You avoided thinking about what he knew. He was present at birth, marriage, and death, the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. Between these, he spoke for a God you feared more than loved, for love, you were told, required obedience. Latin was a language of mass, and it might as well have been a spell. You stood beside your family in church, feet numb from cold, listening to words that never belonged to you. You didn't know what the priest said as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to, that something invisible had happened. The bread wasn't bread, the wine wasn't wine, and the murmured words and gestures moved the divine. You didn't speak the words, but they moved through you anyway. You mouthed along where you could, crossed yourself when others did. You learned the rhythm of holiness, as someone learns a path to a well, not understanding every step, only knowing you needed it. The church dictated when to fast and when to feast. It carved the year into sacred pieces. Lent, Advent, Epiphany, All Saints. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. It told you what to eat, when to eat it, and how guilty to feel about enjoying it. 40 days without meat before Easter, followed by a feast so rich it made you dizzy. Friday fish, even if you lived nowhere near water. Almond milk for the wealthy, turnips and cold broth for everyone else. On saint days, you shared what you could. On fast days, you imagined what you couldn't. Even when your bowl was empty, your plate was full of rules. Your calendar wasn't just for prayer. It was also for payment. The church collected 1/10 of your yield, no matter the season. Grain, eggs, wool, chicken, cider. If it came from your field or your body, it had a price. You gave because it was God's portion, or so you were told. But God didn't collect it. The priest did, or the steward with his ledgers and silent nods. You watched your best barley carted off to the tithe barn, which was always bigger than your home. You saw your neighbor's hand over their last sack of oats while the priest prayed for mercy they had just paid for. And when the harvest failed, when the rains came too late or the frost too early, the demand didn't change. You owed what you owed. Sometimes they let you pay in candles or labor. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt grew so heavy it bent your back even when you stood upright. But the church didn't just take. It gave too, though not always in the way you wanted. It gave stories, structure, reasons. When your cow died without cause, the priest told you which saint to pray to. When your child fell ill, he told you it might be a test, a punishment, or the devil slipping through a crack in your belief. He offered blessings and sacraments, told you to light a candle or visit a shrine. Sometimes he gave you a scrap of relic, an old bone, a tooth, a ribbon soaked in some forgotten martyr's blood. You held it like treasure. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it didn't, it was better than nothing. There were saints for everything. Saint Apollonia for teeth, Saint Isidore for plowing, Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they lived. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories were half memory, half magic, told in flickering firelight by people who weren't sure where truth ended and legend began. You called on them when you had nothing else. You whispered their names as you stirred the pot or knelt in the field. You made deals with them, promised bread, fasting, or a pilgrimage if only they'd help you this once. Sometimes they did or seemed to, and that was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy journey, but also a way to leave. For a few days, you stepped outside the same 5 miles you'd lived your entire life. You walked roads you didn't know, towards shrines you'd only heard of. You carried your prayers with you, strapped to your back, clutched in your hands. You slept under hedges or in the corners of barns. You arrived footsore and weary, stood before a bone or statue, and hoped something would shift inside you. Sometimes it did. You returned not healed but changed, or at least tired enough to believe you had been. Even death was a ritual choreographed by the church. When you felt it near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and words. He touched your forehead, prayed over your body, tried to ease your soul into what came next. Your family gathered. The candles were lit. The bell might ring if someone had the strength. You were buried on sacred ground, beside others who had walked the same path. And then came the masses. Your family lit more candles, paid for prayers, hoped the priest remembered your name in his chants. Because even in death, there were debts. The church taught that your soul might not go straight to heaven. It might linger in purgatory, a shadowed hallway between suffering and salvation. You could wait there for years, centuries, or longer unless someone helped, unless someone prayed, paid, lit enough candles, said your name often enough to pull you through. And so your family paid what they could. The poor gave bread, the rich gave land, all to shorten a stay in a place no one had seen, but everyone feared, because fear, too, was part of the church's gift. The church explained the world when no one else could. It told you why the rains failed, why your child didn't wake, why illness took the young and spared the cruel. It told you that suffering had purpose, that obedience had reward. It gave you structure in the middle of chaos, and that structure, even when it burdened you, gave you peace. Not comfort always, but peace. You never questioned the church's power. Not seriously, not out loud. You might grumble about the tithe or curse when the priest looked the other way, but you never stopped showing up. You didn't stop kneeling. You didn't stop crossing yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church wasn't right, then the world had no shape at all. And a world with no shape was a terrifying thing. Even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded too many taxes, even when the indulgence seller passed through town with a cart full of promises and a purse full of coins, you still believed or acted like you did, which in the end was mostly the same, because belief was less about what you thought than what you did. You didn't understand Aladdin, but you understood the structure. You stayed inside it because it was the only way forward. And when you died, you hoped the bells would ring and the candles would burn. You hoped your name would be said often enough to matter. You hoped the saints still listened. You hoped your sins had been counted and forgiven in equal measure. You hoped the church, in all its weight, mystery, dust, and gold, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after everything they endured, after the famines and plagues, after the tithes and taxes and the heavy boot of manorial authority, peasants would have risen up more often, that the weight of centuries of suffering would have built up until it cracked the walls of their villages, until one cold morning the frost would thaw, and something inside them would snap. You might think they would have gathered in fields and marketplaces, tools in hand and fire in their hearts, shouting that they would kneel no longer. But they didn't. Not often, not for long, and never all at once. There were revolts, yes. The peasants' revolt in England in 1381, the Jacquerie in France a few decades earlier. Small uprisings scattered across Europe, like stones thrown into a still pond. Angry voices in places where the lords had taken too much, pushed too hard, taxed one coin too many. Sometimes a spark caught, a tax collector's house burned, a steward was run out of town, a banner lifted. But those fires burned fast and were snuffed out even faster. They ended in executions, gallows built in village squares, silence heavier than the one that came before. The world didn't change. The grain still had to be sown. To understand why peasants didn't revolt more, you have to stop thinking of them as naive or cowardly. They weren't. They were survivors, not of single tragedies, but of unbroken hardship sustained year after year. They lived in a world of low ceilings where hope was something rationed like grain. They didn't lack courage. They lacked margin. In a life where every day was spent to try and keep the roof patched and the soup warm, there was no space left for rebellion. You could plan a revolt or you could dig potatoes. You couldn't do both. The truth was, the system worked, not because it was just kind or efficient, but because it was ancient. It had sunk its roots into the habits of generations. It didn't need to be explained. It simply was. You owed labor. You owed grain. You owed the church its tenth, and the Lord his harvest. You owed a quiet nod when to reeve. Pass your door. You were born into that owing, and unless you were exceptionally lucky, you died in it, too. But by staying within those bounds, you could survive. Barely, yes, but you could. The cost of stepping outside those rules was too high. The manor had soldiers. The church had excommunication. The king had no idea you existed, but he had laws that still bound you like rope. The penalty for defiance wasn't always death. Sometimes it was worse. The quiet endurance of medieval peasants was not a passive resignation, but an active, unyielding persistence. They lived lives defined by cycles, of seasons, of labor, of hope and despair. And in those cycles, they found ways to assert their humanity. Even when the weight of feudal obligations pressed down on them, they carved out small spaces for themselves, moments where life felt like more than survival. A shared laugh over a poorly told joke, a stolen hour to mend a child's tunic, or the fleeting warmth of sunlight breaking through clouds became acts of defiance against a system that sought to strip them of autonomy. Their resistance wasn't grand or dramatic. It didn't need to be. It lived in the details. In the way they whispered prayers for strength instead of submission. In the way they sang songs about saints while subtly mocking the priest. In the way they bartered goods on the table without ever putting pen to ledger. These were rebellions born of necessity, shaped by circumstance, and honed by generations who understood that outright revolt often meant annihilation. Instead, they practiced what might be called everyday resistance, bending rules just enough to survive, finding loopholes in systems designed to crush them, and preserving their dignity in ways no lord could legislate away. And yet, despite their pragmatism, there were dreams. Not the kind written into charters or etched onto monuments, but dreams whispered in the dark, carried silently in hearts heavy with longing. Dreams of fields they could call their own, of tables groaning with food, of children growing up free from hunger and fear. These dreams weren't naive fantasies. They were lifelines, anchors tethering them to a future they might never see but refuse to abandon. To dream wasn't weakness. It was courage, because dreaming meant believing that change, however distant, was possible. And belief, even in its smallest forms, kept the embers of hope alive. History has a way of erasing these quiet acts of resistance, favoring tales of kings and battles, cathedrals and crusades. But the truth is, the foundations of the medieval world were laid not by lords or clergy, but by the hands of peasants. They plowed the fields that fed armies, mined the stone that built churches, and wove the cloth that clothed nobles. Without them, the grand structures of power would have crumbled, yet their contributions remain largely invisible, buried beneath layers of history written by those who ruled rather than those who endured. Still, the legacy of the peasants endures, not in stone or parchment, but in memory, in stories passed down through generations, in the lullabies sung to restless children, in the recipes handed down from mother to daughter, in the folk remedies whispered across kitchen fires. These fragments of culture, preserved against all odds, are testaments to their resilience. They remind us that while the powerful may shape the visible contours of history, it is the everyday people, the workers, the dreamers, the survivors, who give it depth and meaning. Perhaps this is why the peasant story resonates so deeply today. In a world still rife with inequality, where systems of power often seem insurmountable, their quiet rebellion offers a model of resistance rooted in persistence and adaptability. It teaches us that revolution doesn't always look like banners waving or swords clashing. Sometimes it looks like planting a seed in barren soil, lighting a candle in the darkest night, or simply choosing to rise again each morning despite everything the world throws at you. To endure is to resist. To survive is to rebel. And to persist quietly and stubbornly is to ensure that your voice, however faint, echoes beyond the bound of your time. The medieval peasants may not have overturned the systems that oppressed them, but they outlasted them. They built lives within lives, worlds within worlds, And in doing so, they prove that even the heaviest chains can be worn thin by the steady rhythm of human will. So let us remember them, not as faceless figures bowed beneath the weight of history, but as creators of continuity, keepers of culture, architects of endurance. Let us honor the songs they sang, the stories they told, the fields they tended, and the dreams they dared to hold on to. For in their quiet rebellion lies a lesson timeless and universal, that even when the odds seem impossible, even when the horizon seems impossibly far, the simple act of continuing forward can itself become a triumph. And perhaps, in the end, that is revolution enough